Henrik Ibsen is one of the most consequential playwrights in the history of theater. A dramatic career over the course of many decades. He was born in 1828, lived to 1906, a pretty good long life for that era, and he, quite frankly, revolutionized his medium. He is the one of the greatest sons of Norway. He is a hero, cultural hero to this day, and his work demands recognition in any honest appraisal of culture broadly. He was born to a very well-established family of the patrician merchant class. The family did, however, experience some financial hardship in his youth. Ibsen's immediate family became reliant on extended family for support, and this haunted him, or at least haunts his work throughout his career. He quit school at 15. He worked briefly as an apprentice pharmacist. Interesting, the connection with medicine right there, that will come back. Moved to Christiania, which is modern day Oslo, tried and failed to go to a university, and began writing plays. He wrote several, mostly dramas in verse, a very romantic side to him, throughout his 20s and 30s, none of which were successful. But by age 30, he'd fathered a child out of wedlock, whom he supported but never met, and married another woman who soon bore Ibsen a second son. All the while, he was making very little money. The period of personal struggle coincided in Europe with the European-wide upheaval that climaxed in the revolutions of 1848 and the resurgent reactionary forces that followed. The long repressed forces of change burst forth in a blaze, a cataclysm, only soon to be snuffed out and buried even more heavily than before. This dynamic would find repeated expression in some of his greatest works and characters. The aspirations and the crushing recognition of the limitation to those aspirations. Now, he was largely financially, commercially unsuccessful as a playwright in his youth. But between 1864, when he was around 40 years old, and 1891, he lived mostly abroad, first in Italy and then in Germany. And it was during that time that he became a sensation. He had his first theatrical successes soon after moving abroad, and he really never looked back. And what a run he had. A very prolific writer. His major works include the early play Brand, and then Peer Gynt, a remarkable piece of theater. To this day, it's actually one of his most often produced, even though it is so different in character from his later works. It is a largely romantic era piece, late romantic era piece. It is a poem, it is a play in verse, and it has great themes and characteristics of high romanticism. But it is pushing beyond that very clearly into a kind of early modernism even. He spans quite an awful lot there. Other notable works: The Emperor and the Galilean, 1873, The Pillars of Society, 1877. But then he starts to crank out what we see as the masterworks of his particular character, and these come 1879, A Doll's House, 1881, Ghosts, 1882, Enemy of the People, The Wild Duck in 1884, Lady in the Sea, 1888, Hedda Gabler, 1890, and The Master Builder, 1892. These are remarkable plays, and this is just a very thin sampling of them. Now, Ibsen was very much a product of the intellectual ferment of the late 19th century. He denied most influenced by any other writers, but scholars love ferreting these things out and hypothesizing. Critics can point to the idealism of Hegel as being formative for the young playwright. Ibsen himself admitted the influence of Soren Kierkegaard, the famous philosopher, particularly in Ibsen's early work. Peer Gynt was produced with musical collaboration by Edvard Grieg, the composer. Ibsen maintained a fierce rivalry with his Swedish playwright counterpart August Strindberg, and a very young James Joyce claimed to be so overwhelmed by Ibsen that he tried studying Dano-Norwegian to experience the writing directly. Joyce's success in that endeavor was never really confirmed, let's say. He may have been exaggerating a little as how much he was able to achieve in that. But Ibsen's work is often credited as primary examples of the so-called problem play, which tend to use relatively simple plots that revolve around singular social issues or political topics. This term itself is an evolution of the so-called well-made play, which comes from French theater and is generally marked by rigidly structured plots, bordering on, if not kowtowing immediately or collapsing immediately to formulaic plots. They very frequently turn on the discovery of a portentous letter that trips off the dramatic climax of the play. Ibsen takes this very confining formula and pushes it out to emphasize character instead of just plot. The themes that are explored in the developments of the plot, but with a greater emphasis on the subtleties of meaning that go beyond mere theater and entertainment value. Ibsen takes this as a kind of heroic mission to move beyond the simple execution of the story that the realist framework of his work would seem to lean on, and the recalibration of the balance between plot and meaning and significance, between form and content, let's say, proved to be very successful with critics and audiences alike. So in Ibsen, look for, number one, high realism. His characters are always very within their milieu. The portraits of the characters are almost always upper middle class, but with feeling the gravity of social forces and financial limitations, let's say, dragging them down. And they're always trying to work around that, but keep being limited to the consequences of their actions and the realist framework of this is sometimes all that you can expect. This opens those situations up for a kind of criticism, for a kind of social critique, where he is not just portraying characters with problems, but forcing us all to think about, well, that's, that problem seems kind of familiar, and why does it have to be that way? Whether the problem is economics or social justice of some form or another, or just the harshness of life and why we all have to struggle so much. Those ideas are brought up to the fore constantly in his work, and being aware that this is the core project he's involved with helps in understanding the plots themselves. Part and parcel of this, I would say, is some of the inherent radicalism in it. Now, he is very much a comfortable man of the bourgeoisie. He begins fairly comfortably. He goes through a rough patch, but he ends up pretty comfortably as well. But he is not afraid to throw some elbows in that. He is not afraid to call out the unfairness of his society, and good for him for being able to recognize those things. Of course, you can recognize the somewhat rigid outlines of plot structure, of simple dramatic execution of a story. And there's a lot to be said for that. He is a master of it. And there is no point when you're watching a play of his, there's no point where you don't know exactly where you are realistically within the drama playing out in front of you. But even with that, even as he is sticking so closely to plot development and the exploration of what all the meaning that can be found in them, he does start, particularly in the later career, pushing toward the symbolist movement, where things are much more nuanced, where meaning is much more subjective, and there is a kind of unresolved quality to even the simplest plot resolutions that sit with you as you finish and leave the theater, so called. And you can see this is an artist for whom you can go and have a wonderful evening in the theater, but then afterwards, as you're maybe getting a drink after the theater, or maybe riding home, and you're just thinking, all of these questions start oozing up around you, and they are potent questions, and they are unresolvable questions, and that is part of his enduring legacy as well. Now, Ibsen suffered a debilitating stroke at the start of the 20th century, bringing his output essentially to an end. He died just a few years later at the ripe old age of 78. He had struggled professionally until he was in his 40s. From then, Ibsen had a remarkable run, a steady production of a dozen or so plays, each coming out every couple of years. And these works make him today the second most internationally successful playwright behind Shakespeare. To this day, Ibsen plays are near constant in productions around the world.